So I wanted to just say thanks for inviting me down to South America. First time I've actually been, so it's a nice place to be. And I thought I'd go talk a bit about, I might have gone word of that Bitcoin's roadmap and headaches, but I'll copy what was on the diagram. And I think what's interesting about this is really, right now we've got a bunch of interesting stuff coming up. We have SegWit, which got released, what would it be, 1 or 2 weeks ago, and already we can see that we do have quite a bit of adoption. Where are we? That little graph there, that's your beginnings of version 0.13.1 nodes, which actually implement SegWit and so on. And in terms of a roadmap, this is one of those things where you can actually easily give dates. You can go say, well, when can miners start supporting this? Was it November 14th or so? When's the earliest that could actually activate? Sometime potentially around December. When will it actually activate? Well, this is where things kind of get interesting. But let's assume it does. That's your block size increase from the point of view normal transactions, 2 megabytes. From the point of view of attackers, some cases 4 megabytes, and some cases with multi-sig and so on. And the other big thing, of course, is that by fixing mutability, we do make it possible to do things like Lightning, as well as many other types of new smart contracts. And again, you've probably heard of Lightning, but really I think this represents algorithmic scaling, in the sense that we're finally deploying something that actually changes Bitcoin from this frankly terrible, ON squared scaling where everybody has a copy of every single other person's transaction, to something a little saner, a little more efficient. And if you look at the early discussions of Bitcoin, back when it was first released, immediately people pointed out, hang on a second, this doesn't scale. So it's nice to kind of see this finally, finally ending up happening. Of course, when we were talking about roadmap, when does this come out? Well, again, this is one of those things where it's tricky to go put dates on. Do people end up adopting it? What sort of use cases do people adopt on? Many of these use cases that you'll see could have actually been adopted 3 years ago. More in miniature versions, just to do things like keep coins out of the hands of exchanges. As an example of payment channels, it would be very easy for an exchange like Bitfinex to work by you setting up a channel with them. When you do a trade, you actually give them the minimum amount of money necessary to do the trade and so on. And unfortunately, we just didn't see that. So it'll be interesting to see how this tech actually progresses now that we have this sort of flagship use case, and whether or not the sort of more in miniature versions this get adopted as well. And also, of course, got to talk a little bit about smart contracts. We're here talking about Bitcoin mostly, but there's this whole other ecosystem, particularly with Ethereum, of smart contracts. And I think the really tough thing for that has really been, as you can see, making them actually go work, making them stable. And with Ethereum, as much as they've been really pushing the boundaries of experimentation, I think they found that sort of putting all the logic in one place has been very difficult. Every time they go have an exploit, they got to go fix it. They got to go fix it at the basic level. And when you fix it, well, then you go change things. This is just one of many, many headlines on this. One of the other problems has been, how do you go and fix the things that are broken by your fixes? And just to kind of give you an idea where I think things are going in the Bitcoin space and things built on top of Bitcoin, you can kind of think about Bitcoin versus Ethereum as sort of the telephone system versus the internet. And with the telephone system, that telephone you're looking at is really dumb. I don't know if you've ever taken apart a rotary telephone, but they basically don't have any electronics. They're a couple switches and a bit of mechanics. And when we moved to, touch-tone telephones, again, it was pretty much the same story, other than a signal generator to make the little buzzing sounds. But what was amazing about the telephone system was all the smarts. Your phone connected to this incredible network that did so much, had so much logic in it. Did call waiting, did routing across planets and so on. Compared to the telephone that you used, it was a very smart network. Of course, when you go to the internet, The architecture is the exact opposite. Your phone in your pocket is an internet node. And your phone in your pocket could probably go land a man on Mars with how much processing power it has. Probably could land, you know, 1 million men on Mars per second if you wanted to get a benchmark on it. And yet the internet itself, you know, that core layer, unlike the telephone system in relation, it's really dumb. All it actually does is you go send packets around. And what we're seeing in terms of, I think, smart contract evolution is this realization that a lot of things could probably be better done with the logic on the client. And we're seeing this as an example in Blockstack, where they're doing quite complex stuff. Us, you know, Bitcoin devs, many of us don't necessarily approve of what they're doing, but it doesn't really matter. You know, we're not the ones writing the code. We're not the ones creating their infrastructure. From their point of view, the Bitcoin blockchain is this really dumb thing, and they go build services on top of it by using it as an append-only log. Another example is my own open timestamps work, which does one thing really simple, which is creates timestamp proof, and you can build things around it. As a Bitcoin core dev, what did I do to enable open timestamps? Well, nothing. Not a damn thing. Because again, it uses Bitcoin as a very simple layer. So when we're talking about roadmaps, those kind of use cases, they're kind of interesting because they don't need to be on a roadmap. You know, it's, as a Bitcoin dev, anything I do is completely irrelevant to that kind of use case, yet you can still innovate. And, you know, I think maybe then really we can talk about, well, hang on, like, why are we talking about roadmaps at all? I mean, just to give an example, the Linux kernel is this massive open source project. Very centralized infrastructure, very centralized management. You've got Linus Torvalds at the top. You know, you've got his second tier of managers underneath him and so on. Yet, well, what does Linus say about a roadmap? Well, you know, he thinks about the current release, the next release, and that's about it. And, you know, ultimately he's kind of accepted that in any software development, it's very difficult to go say, all right, we will implement this by this date, we will implement that by that date. Now, once you've done the basic groundwork, which, for instance, has happened with SegWit, you can put dates down. But when you're still talking about new development, particularly experimental development, frankly, it's tough to go say, you know, what we're talking about with roadmaps. And, you know, ultimately, I can't really promise to you when will we make Bitcoin scale, as an example. I can go say it looks like Lightning's promising. It's still experimental. And we can go and hopefully do this and this and this. But I would be a bit dishonest for you to go put a date on developments like that. Whereas if I want to go put a date on, you know, when SegWit activates, hey, I can go do that for sure, you know, provided other people actually agree. Which of course gets to the other thing. I mean, Bitcoin is not a centralized project. You know, Bitcoin is really a very political type of project where there's many, many different actors. And this adds this whole new development. And going back to the title of this talk, one of the main headaches with Bitcoin development, which is you as the developer, you're not in control. You know, we're people creating software, we're people coming up with new ideas, we're people creating algorithms, but this all has to get adopted by others. And this, I think, going forward is both turned into a really ugly mess right now, and also probably will get worse. You know, this raised a lot of challenges. I mean, one of them, for instance, is getting new developers into the space. And I think a lot of people are very turned away by this because they know there's money involved, there's very controversial politics involved, there's a lot of, frankly, lying and slander and so on involved. And one of the big challenges, I think, going forward will be how do we actually navigate this? How do we deal with this? It's kind of, I'm not going to go into too much detail on exactly who. I don't think this is the right place to start naming names or anything, but I can go talk about myself. And, you know, here's a photo we actually got from the end of that meeting we had in Hong Kong with big chunk of the hashing power. You can see me in my red shirt up on the right there. And I think that's a good example of how hard it's been to deal with these kind of politics where, you know, that agreement coming out of there, I'm frankly quite responsible for it in that, you know, I really pushed a lot of the language of it. I got a lot of the framework there. And of course, my intent with it was quite simple. Can we get a bunch of people in a room to hash out what we could agree on and then go to the wider public? Well, you know, I think we were successful at that. And of course, it got reported as we've decided where Bitcoin's going. You know, we've decided what will happen next. And unsurprisingly, when that was presented that way, the backlash in the Bitcoin development community was pretty severe. And it got even worse when, you know, by many people's views, F2 Pool immediately broke the agreement anyway by mining Bitcoin Classic blocks. So, you know, that's, I think, is a lesson learned, and I'm not really sure where we go next with it, but it's a tricky one, I think, precisely because you have a group of people who are almost antithetical to that kind of control and, you know, don't want to be in that kind of control. And of course, someone like me, I mean, I went into that hopefully presenting myself as not really representative of anyone, but saying, you know, look, I know these people, they have these viewpoints, you know, if you go and do these kinds of things, maybe this is how you can go bridge that gap. And it doesn't get presented that way. You know, people want that kind of authority figure. And we're also seeing, I think, ViaBTCs very interesting here, where, first of all, you know, this very idea of, all right, what would you do to support SegWit? Well, no, you're just not going to. You know, right there, that's someone saying, well, we're going to use our control. You know, we're going to use our ability to go block SegWit activation. Whether or not they still have the ability, I mean, that'll be an interesting question going forward. But, you know, you also see statements about them talking about, well, what's the role of miners in the ecosystem? You know, who's in control? And I know ViaBTC has made statements along the lines of essentially, well, miners are in control. They decide the rules. And again, going back to the politics, well, that's a very strong statement to kind of make. And, you know, it'll be interesting to kind of see, is this going to be a power grab? Is this going to be, you know, people kind of bluffing? I mean, I don't really know. I'll also go point out, I think, you know, in the future, we've got a lot of interesting questions about miner centralization. You know, BitName recently announced that they had a very big facility in the plans. This, by the way, I should point out, is a CGI rendering. But, you know, depending on what happens and how they go build that out, potentially have the equivalent of about 75% of today's hashing power in one place. Now, BitMain says that the facility, you know, the actual equipment in there won't be owned by them. It'll be, you know, they're providing a space, providing a service. Many, many different people will own the equipment and so on. But ultimately, that's a lot of equipment under one roof. And that's a big point of control. You know, for instance, somewhere over there, there's a bunch of transformers feeding it. And if I go over there with a shotgun, I could probably turn off a big chunk of Bitcoin in the future. You know, that's an interesting thing to kind of navigate through, and it'll raise a lot of questions. I mean, I myself, I've often argued in the past that we probably have natural incentives for decentralization by the simple fact that you can't get that much cheap power in one place. This, to me, suggests I might be wrong. You know, and that's kind of unfortunate, and we're not really sure where that'll go. Equally, you probably heard earlier from Zuko talking about Equihash and their efforts to go do a proof of work that was more accessible by the masses. And I've got a lot of technical objections to Equihash. I suspect it's not actually going to work out as planned, but you know, it's interesting how one of the competition to Bitcoin will be these kind of alternate efforts. And finally, I'll go point out, you know, in terms of SegWit, hearing miners support it is interesting, but hearing people with control of coins support it, you know, that's really your show of support. Because if you don't believe ViaBTC's view of, say, how Bitcoin works, and you think that users are ultimately in control of the protocol, you know, after all, if you're running a node, you're the one deciding what is the protocol, what is the definition of Bitcoin. Well, BitGo is trusted by many, many people to hold their money, essentially, to define what the Bitcoin protocol is on their behalf. So really, by them saying that we're going to run SegWit, they're the ones saying, yes, we as economic majority, or at least part of that economic majority, are deciding what the protocol is. And one of the things in relation to hard forks that I think is kind of coming up is figuring out better ways to determine that. You know, to their credit, while Ethereum didn't get much participation in this, when they did their initial hard fork, they did at least put it up for a vote by people's coins. You know, that's a very imperfect measure, but at least it is trying to get some feedback from the actual owners of Ether. And I know I'm working on trying to determine ways of doing this for hard forks. I mean, in particular, you know, if we're in an environment where a big chunk of the user base decides to go one way and a big chunk of miners decide to go the other way, we will split Bitcoin in two. You know, and there will be things in the future where we want to do hard forks. I mean, that's just a fact of life. You know, even if it's not related to block size increases, there will probably be technical improvements where we want to do a hard fork. And we need to find better ways to get people to show their agreement, to, you know, give feedback on it, to kind of show their consent. So you can kind of say that's on the roadmap, but ultimately, again, that's a big research question. I don't think we've really figured out how this works. And it's, you know, in the context of a very politicized system around issues of governance. So with that, do I have time for questions?
Yes. Finally from the booth.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering do you believe that in 5 years Bitcoin will be using the same proof of work as today? In 5 years?
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question. I mean, a lot of people have disagreements on this, but I suspect basically yes. Or put it another way, if it changes proof of work, the way that'll happen is not by Bitcoin changing the proof of work, but by value leaving Bitcoin to a different currency. You know, really the reason why I think I say that is just figuring out how to go change proof of work from one system to another is really difficult because, I mean, imagine if you're a miner. You might have, you know, $10 million worth of equipment that hashes SHA-1. What incentive do you have to go support something that destroys all that value? There may be ways to do transitions, but so far we haven't found really good ones. So, you know, I think it really, whether or not that's true really comes down to, you know, how does this ASIC environment look and how do we find transition mechanisms?
Yes. Sorry. There's coming the mic. Can we turn it on? Yes. We have 2 mics. Okay, shout it and then we say it again for the video.
So the question was, do you think Bitcoin will become more of a settlement payment network than cash payments? And I think the answer to that is, I personally suspect you'll see a bit more of that settlement in the context of things like Lightning, where, you know, you as a user, you may not directly use Bitcoin for many of your transactions, but you'll still use a decentralized system on top of that. However, my suspicion is in the long run, we'll be able to make blockchains actually scale. You know, I mean, I've got a lot of ideas around sharding and so on, and many other people are working on this kind of thing. And I suspect, and I may be wrong, but I suspect that we can make Bitcoin scale better than, you know, the O(n) squared of everyone having everything. You know, essentially the way that could work is, roughly speaking, if you can find some way for miners to collaboratively mine the chain without having the entire contents of every transaction. You know, so some miners are mining some transactions, some miners are mining other transactions. I suspect that with systems where users validate transactions rather than assuming miners do, that probably is enough to go build a system where you can still transact on chain, so to speak, you know, at scale. And if we're successful at that, which, you know, might be 5 years, 10 years away, then Bitcoin, I'm sure it will be still used for settlements too, but, you know, it would be a network where you can transact directly. Equally, I mean, after all, if Lightning works out as promised, it is a decentralized network. You know, from that point of view, if you say Lightning is a part of Bitcoin, well, yeah, people are using Bitcoin as a transactional network, not just settlement. So we'll see.
Yes, the blue guy.
Yeah, absolutely I do. And you know, the reason is, when you look at Ethereum, when they split in two in a context of environment where people were not using Ethereum for commerce. You know, they weren't using Ethereum to send money back home. They weren't, you know, buying things with Ethereum. Whereas in Bitcoin, we have a very big group of users who are not up to date on what's happening. You know, they're just using Bitcoin because they need to send money. You know, they're not using Bitcoin because they want to go and invest in the latest thing. You know, they're not excited about smart contracts necessarily. And for those users, well, what happens when Bitcoin splits? You know, when I want to send money home, which Bitcoin do I use? And like it or not, I think that would really, really shake confidence in Bitcoin. And I don't think it's something we really want to risk lightly. Now, if the split happens where it's at least a reasonable split where people call this, you know, the new thing's a different name, that might not be such a big deal. But there's a lot of psychology here, which is that if you have two people claiming they both have, you know, the right to the Bitcoin name, who knows what happens? You know, and I think that would be incredibly confusing for the markets.
Someone else? We still have time for 1-2 questions. Nope. Okay. Well,
Thank you.
thank you, Peter.